Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dennis Kelleher, President and CEO of Better Markets, and I'd like to welcome everyone here today and welcome the audience watching on C-SPAN. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, C-SPAN, for covering this event. I'd like to especially welcome Antonio Weiss, the Counselor to the Treasury Secretary, for joining us, and the many congressional and executive branch staffers, many of whom put in months of incredibly hard work on what we now call, rather casually, the Dodd-Frank law, including, in particular, the former staff directors for both the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee. I'd also like to recognize someone who had the vision 5 years ago to see that financial reform is really about making markets work for everyone. It was really about building a stronger, safer financial system that protects and promotes America's businesses, jobs, savings, homes, retirements, and so much more. He saw a need for an independent, nonpartisan, professional organization dedicated to supporting, defending, and fighting for the public interest in the financial markets and the D.C. policymaking process. That was Mike Masters, who's the founder of Better Markets, who's also joining us here today. Now, tomorrow, as you all know, is the 5th anniversary of President Obama signing the historic Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act into law, the most significant financial reform legislation since the Great Depression. We have a terrific program today, including both Senator Chris Dodd and former Congressman Barney Frank, along with Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. I will begin with a discussion of a report that Better Markets is releasing today on the cost of the crisis. And a copy of that report is on every chair, and it's available on our website, www.bettermarkets.com. But before I begin, let me start with a few quick housekeeping matters. First, the Treasury Secretary is delivering his address starting at 4, and that will close our event. Once he's finished, we ask that you please stay in your seats until the Secretary has departed. Second, if you haven't already done so, please turn the ringers off on your cell phones. We'll know who you are when you forget to do that. Finally, for those of you joining us here in the audience, you'll notice that there are index cards on your chairs. If you have a question you'd like to ask either Chris Dodd or Barney Frank, please write it down and pass it to our staff on either side of the studio, and we'll see if we can get a few of them answered. Now let's review the crash and the cost of the crisis. Some may ask, why begin a 5th-year anniversary event by talking about what happened actually more than 5 years ago? Well, the answer is quite simple. To really understand where we are and where we need to go, we first need to look back to understand how we got here. This is all the more important because in the last 5 years, the discussion has dramatically shifted from the financial collapse, the economic crisis, the cost to the country, and the industry's role in causing it all, to the financial reform law, the rules necessary to implement it, and the claimed cost from all that. In fact, the way some people talk in this town, it would be news to them to learn that the world didn't actually start 5 years ago when the Dodd-Frank law was signed. You see it every day. Almost all the discussion of the Dodd-Frank law, the rules to implement it, and financial reform generally fail to even mention why the law was passed, or the historic crash, or the cost that made it so necessary. But without this critical context, it is impossible to understand what the law was trying to prevent from happening again and why it's so important. Now, none of that is to suggest that the law is perfect. The people in this room know better than almost anybody that no law is perfect. It is, however, the best law that our political system could produce at that time. And as the facts of the crash and the economic crisis show, it's a very, very important law. So let's start with the basic overriding facts. The financial crash of 2008 was the worst crash since the Great Crash of 1929. It caused the worst economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. That's why it's been named the Great Recession. That crash and the economic catastrophe it caused are ultimately going to cost the people of the United States more than $20 trillion in lost gross domestic product and massive human suffering. That's what's detailed in the report we are releasing today. The top line number is $20 trillion and counting, and this report, about 120 pages worth, including too many footnotes that I care to count, go through chapter and verse of what it costs this country, and we hope you take the time to look at it. That's why 5 years ago, President Obama signed the Dodd-Frank law to try and make sure this never happens again to our country. So let's take a quick look back to review the crisis and the cost. Almost 7 years ago, the financial crisis began a terrifying spiral downward. When Lehman collapsed on September 15th, 2008, it ignited a series of almost unimaginable events captured in the headlines that I hope you had a chance to see on the side of the studio on the way in. This being the museum, I thought it'd be appropriate to review that story and the crisis through the headlines that announced it to the world as it developed. This is Monday, September 15th. The papers didn't know it, but Lehman had filed for bankruptcy that night. But the headlines blared, "Crisis on Wall Street as Lehman totters, Merrill seeks a buyer, AIG hunts for cash." The next day, U.S. takes over AIG in an $85 billion bailout. Central banks inject cash as credit dries up, just the day after. Mounting fear shake world markets as banking giants rush to raise capital 3 days after Lehman collapses. You notice in the lower right-hand corner, already the worst crisis since the 1930s, with no end yet in sight. An email from the recent AIG trial that came out shows that on Friday, February 19th, it's an internal Federal Reserve Bank of New York email, and I'll read it to you. Quote, FYI, Morgan Stanley called New York Fed President Tim Geithner late last night, it's Friday, September 19th, and indicated they cannot open on Monday, September 22nd. Morgan Stanley advised Goldman Sachs of this, and Goldman Sachs is now panicked because they feel that if Morgan Stanley does not open, then Goldman Sachs is toast, close quote. That's merely 4 days after the bankruptcy filing of Lehman. It's easy to forget now how things were spiraling out of control and unimaginable events were happening. If anybody asked a week before if you thought a week later that neither Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs could open their doors, nobody would have believed you saying it. The markets are in disarray, lending locks up, the Dow is crashing every day. The new phase in financial crisis as the investors run to safety. The U.S. drafts sweeping plan to fight the crisis as the turmoil worsens in the credit markets. And there's something interesting about this particular headline. I don't know if you noticed the picture, but that's President George W. Bush. If you read much of the reporting on the crash and the crisis, you wouldn't actually know that the crash happened when he was president, or that TARP happened when he was president, or many of the bailouts happened when he was president. In fact, people are often surprised to learn that President Obama had not even been elected yet. This is September. And that's what I mean when you say you need a little context in history, which is too often missed in all the reporting on not just the Dodd-Frank law, but even the crash. And things, of course, kept getting worse. We had a money market mutual fund that broke the buck, that resulted in the Treasury effectively guaranteeing the $3.7 trillion money market industry. I think the country was around about 237 years at that time. It was the first time that such action had ever been taken in the country. And then, as the email from the prior Friday presaged, and the call from Morgan Stanley, the Fed President Tim Geithner, suggested, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley scrapped the Wall Street model and became banks in a bid to ride out the crisis. Now, if anybody said that was going to happen a week or two before, nobody would have believed it. And it did. And that's what was happening on a daily basis. Unimaginable, actually catastrophic events were happening as the financial system was spiraling into a crash. Wells Fargo, eyes Wachovia, crisis hits European banks. That's the bad news. The good news, at least according to some, it says Treasury and Congress sign off on a bailout package. Citing grave financial threats, officials readied a massive bailout package, and we'll hopefully get the insights from Chris Dodd and Barney Frank about some of these events and some of these meetings in the next hour. So the bailout plan then, of course, as you'll all remember, was rejected by the House. And what happens, of course, is the markets crash. Once again, policymakers, government officials, and the markets are plunged to the abyss with no one really knowing what happens next. TARP, of course, ultimately was passed, $700 billion, on October 3rd, 2008. Another part of the discussion that happens since then and now is they talk about TARP as being the only part of the bailout, when, of course, we all know that's not true, and I'll return to that in a minute. And then, using the TARP money, the United States bought stakes in the nation's largest banks. Who would have predicted that? No one. And we must remember, when we're thinking about what Dodd-Frank was responding to and what it was trying to prevent, is not just a recurrence of what exactly happened, but the conditions and circumstances under which a future financial crisis might happen when equally unimaginable events occur that today no one foresees and everyone would discount. The $700 billion TARP bailout was just a small part of the trillions in bailouts. The Federal Reserve Board, the Treasury, and the FDIC guaranteed lent or otherwise used many trillions of dollars more in bailouts and rescue programs. Here's just one, as you all know. There's the zero interest rate policy that's been in effect since the crisis. The Fed's balance sheet ballooned to more than $4 trillion. And the crash continued deep into 2009, as did the economic crisis, something else that's often forgotten. People often think that the crisis essentially peaked when Lehman collapsed or in the few days or months after that. Well into 2009, the economic crisis continued, as did the financial collapse. This, of course, is one indicator of the economic crisis. That's the Dow. Ultimately, we now know with hindsight that March 9th of 2009 was the low. At the time, nobody knew that was the low. And of course, when you look at the trajectory, you had good reason to wonder where the bottom was. And one of the most important documents, I think, in the entire crisis, and indeed maybe in the history of the country, and maybe the most overlooked, is a joint statement on February 23rd of 2009, issued by Treasury, the FDIC, OCC, OTS, and the Federal Reserve. Let me just quote. The government will ensure that banks have the capital and liquidity they need to provide the credit necessary to restore economic growth. Moreover, we reiterate our determination to preserve the viability of systemically important financial institutions so that they're able to meet their commitments, close quote. This is February 23rd of 2009, pretty deep into 2009, and the financial crisis is still so bad that this statement was issued, effectively putting the full faith and credit of the United States behind the financial system, effectively putting the wallets of all taxpayers in the United States behind the financial system. That's what happened, and that's what was at stake at the time. Then there were enormous human, social, and government costs. This chart is the U6 rate month by month. The U6 rate is under and unemployed Americans. Unemployed is a well-known concept. Underemployed means you're forced to work part-time because you can't find full-time work. And what this chart shows that it exceeded 17% in October of 2009 and remained above 17% for 5 of the next 7 months. And even when it got a little below 17%, you can see it still remained incredibly high month after month. So what is 17.6 or 17.5%? To put it in perspective, it equals the entire population of the state of Texas, and it's 1 out of every 6 workers in the United States. And it compounds month after month. And that's only the people who are getting unemployment or are unemployed. And of course, many of those were heads of households. So the implication of just this part of the crisis, the employment part of the crisis, affected many tens of millions of Americans, well into the 50 and 60 million. You've got 27 million Americans directly affected, many heads of households. So the ripple effect into about 50 or 60 million Americans of what we're talking about affected just from employment. Housing prices collapsed back to 2001 levels relatively quickly. Historic foreclosures were out of control, millions and millions of foreclosures. Small businesses were crushed. As economic activity plummeted, one of the frontline organizations and firms to feel that are small business, and they started going bankrupt at historic rates due to the complete collapse of economic activity. And underwater homes, really the silent crisis in this country, when over 30%, which is to say the mortgages were much higher than the value that the homes could be sold for in the markets as prices collapsed. And you can even see, even through today, there's still way too many underwater homes. There are tens of millions of Americans and families behind those numbers. This is just one picture you could take in 08, 09, 2010, 2011 of lines at job fairs. This was one in Atlanta. This is children at the Wickham Elementary School in southern Florida in October of 2011. And at the time, every weekday, more than 200,000 hungry students were getting free or reduced lunches because they couldn't afford them, often, almost always, because of unemployment and foreclosures and homelessness. And at the time, in that county, the economy was so bad that 7 out of 10 students, 71%, were eligible for those lunches. This is, I think, one of the most telling photos. The ripple effect at the state and local level from the collapse of the economy and the financial crisis. This is fellow firefighters applauding a 5-year veteran at the Camden Fire Department who's telling them to keep up their hopes as they prepare to turn in their gear after being laid off. Camden laid off 1/3 of its firefighters. And that act was repeated with firefighters, cops, teachers, and a whole bunch of other state, local, municipal workers because of the collapse in tax revenue and the diversion of resources to mitigate the economic effects of the financial crisis. Here's a man who's unemployed who applying for food stamps in February of 2011. Food stamp use in the country skyrocketed in 2011 to ultimately being used by 43.6 million Americans. That should surprise no one when you look at the unemployment numbers and the foreclosure numbers and the underwater home numbers. And this woman in 2010 holds an unemployment check from Burbank, California. She was laid off from a quality assurance job where she was making $100,000 a year. And this is the quote from her. "It really gets me when they say, 'You lazy people.' They have no idea how depressing that is when you have been beating your head against the wall trying to find work," close quote. That was the economy facing tens of millions of Americans. With tax revenues plummeting and social needs skyrocketing, government deficits and debt ballooned. So as you can see, I hope you can see if you've got really good eyesight maybe, but it balloons starting in 2008 and really takes off in 09, 2010, and 2011. That's because tax revenues evaporated as economy and economic activity dropped and social needs skyrocketed. This is a very telling chart. This is the U.S. debt as a percentage of U.S. gross domestic product. So in January of 2008, the CBO projected the debt as a percentage of GDP in 2018 at 22.6%. Just 3 years later, CBO ran their projections again in January of 2011, and in 2018, U.S. debt as a percentage of GDP skyrocketed to 75.3%. One thing and one thing only happened between those two projections of any magnitude, and that was the financial crash and the economic crisis it caused. And this is a chart that shows you real tax revenue is still lower in the second quarter of 2014 in 29 states since the recession. So not only did it go down in all 50 states at the time of the recession, at the time of the crash, in the years afterwards, deep into last year, and in fact continuing into this year, real revenues are still down. It's interesting, the same thing has happened in the private charitable sector. Nobody talks about this. Charitable contributions declined as the economic crisis continues, and charities were asked to provide more services with less support. The exact same problems that squeezed federal, state, and local governments squeezed the charitable sector too. In fact, charitable giving declined the worst in 50 years. Again, no surprise, this shock was the worst shock since the Great Crash of '29 and the Great Depression of the 1930s. So you would think you'd have roughly similar declines in other activity, including charitable giving. So public finances are tremendously stressed. Deficits and debt drive decision-making. private charitable activities suffered, large endowment losses and contributions declined. Virtually every issue anyone cares about has suffered due to the trillions of dollars both expended or used to stop the financial crash and mitigate the damage from the economic crisis. This is just one example. So federal financing for R&D, which of course underpins much of our economic growth and leverages the R&D in the private sector, from 2009 to 2014, it dropped a calamitous 26.7%. But that's not the only area that saw a collapse. Almost everything has suffered from cuts and underfunding, from education, poverty, arts, science, housing, the environment, energy, you name it. Every one of those issues has seen funding cuts since the 2008 financial crash on both the public and private funding side. Many of those cuts have been very significant. Even if future funding increases, it will never make up for the lost jobs, homes, funding for these programs, the R&D that wasn't done, and indeed, in many cases, lost lives and lost dreams. Let me conclude by mentioning just one other cost, which is never mentioned. That's the exploitation of financial reform for political and partisan gain. Given the devastating cost of the crash and the crisis inflicted on tens of millions of American families, workers, and businesses, preventing such a catastrophe from happening again should not be a political or a partisan issue. After all, the economic wreckage and the cost knows no party affiliation, as this chart shows. Right? The economic calamity caused by the financial crash hit everyone regardless of political affiliation. So this chart shows, by state, the average U6 rate for roughly a year, from the fourth quarter of 2009 to the third quarter of 2010. And it's broken down by red state and blue state. And what it shows is that the economic wreckage from the financial crash really doesn't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, whether you're the East Coast or West Coast or the middle of the country. The economic wreckage actually inflicted massive damage in every part of this country. And that's why it shouldn't be a political issue or a partisan issue, because the wreckage wasn't political or partisan. The financial crash and the economic catastrophe it caused is what made financial reform and Dodd-Frank so essential. Preventing that from happening again is what financial reform is really all about. It's not about numbers and statistics. It's about protecting Americans' jobs, businesses, homes, savings, retirements, and standard of living. It's also about making sure that public funds are never again diverted from social priorities to bail out reckless financial activities. And that's also why the Dodd-Frank financial reform law must be fully implemented and aggressively policed, as soon as possible, as strongly as possible, and as durably as possible. So that is, in summary, the cost of the crisis and a review of the crash, which is the essential context one needs to understand the Dodd-Frank law, to talk about the Dodd-Frank law, I think, on an informed basis.